Two houses. At first glance, they could belong to the same neighborhood. The first is in Brazil. It has a garage, a living room, a kitchen, two bathrooms, and a clay tile roof. But hidden between the walls and the roof is a component that rarely appears in property photos. A storage tank made of plastic, fiberglass, concrete, or another suitable material connected to the water main through a float valve. It's the water tank. While the street's water main is supplying the property, water passes through the meter, rises through the building supply line, and fills this tank. Then, when someone opens a faucet, the water flows down through the pipes and reaches the fixture primarily through the force of gravity. Now, travel across the continent and look at a typical suburban home in the United States. There's a pitched roof, a chimney, a two-car garage, and perhaps a small lawn in front of the facade. But there's no visible water tank, no large reservoir hidden above the ceiling, no elevated structure built in the backyard. Even so, just turn on the faucet. The water arrives immediately. It supplies the sink, shower, washing machine, toilet, and even the lawn sprinklers. In many cases, it arrives with enough pressure to serve several of these fixtures at the same time. How can two such similar houses use such different water supply systems? Why does the Brazilian home often store hundreds or thousands of gallons within the building itself, while the American home usually receives water directly from the street? The explanation almost everyone repeats is incomplete. The first answer seems obvious. Americans don't need water tanks because their water supply is never interrupted. But that isn't true. Broken pipes, scheduled maintenance, power failures, storms, droughts, freezing temperatures, contamination, and other problems also interrupt water systems in the United States. Hurricanes can damage pumping stations. Cold waves can rupture water mains. Accidents can force a city to temporarily shut down part of the system. American water doesn't possess some special property that makes it immune to infrastructure failures. The difference lies in how often interruptions happen, how long they last, and, above all, how each system was designed to handle fluctuations in demand and service disruptions. That leads to the second explanation. American homes don't use water tanks because the water arrives at higher pressure. That's generally closer to the truth, but it still doesn't answer the question. Saying a house doesn't need a tank because it receives pressurized water is like saying a light bulb works because there's electricity at the outlet. The statement is correct, but it doesn't explain where that electricity came from or how it remains available. The pressure at a home's service entrance is the result of reservoirs, pumps, pipes, valves, pressure zones, and control systems installed long before the water reaches the meter. It's a consequence of urban infrastructure, not a complete explanation by itself. The third theory says the water tank is an old technology, and the United States simply uses a more modern solution. That isn't true either. Elevated storage tanks are still used in cities, factories, hospitals, residential complexes, and modern buildings. Water towers are part of the landscape in hundreds of American communities. In New York City, rooftop water tanks are so common that they have become part of the city's visual identity. A technology doesn't become obsolete simply because it uses gravity. In fact, few solutions are as reliable as allowing water to flow downward naturally. The fourth theory says it's all just a matter of construction tradition. Brazilians install tanks because they've always done it that way, while Americans connect homes directly to the main because that's the local custom. Tradition does matter. Architects, plumbers, builders, manufacturers, and public authorities tend to repeat solutions they already understand. An entire city doesn't change its plumbing model overnight, but technical traditions usually endure because they solve real problems. If we want to understand why the tank sits above a house, we shouldn't begin with the roof. we need to go back several steps and follow the water before it reaches the building. It all begins at the source. Depending on the city, water may be drawn from a river, reservoir, lake, or underground aquifer. It then passes through treatment processes designed to remove particles, control microorganisms, and bring it within drinking water standards. After treatment, that water must be transported to neighborhoods that may be miles away and at different elevations. It travels through transmission mains, reservoirs, pumping stations, and progressively smaller distribution pipes until it finally reaches the service line connected to each property. The challenge isn't merely transporting water. The system has to deliver it whenever people want to use it. And a city's water consumption is never constant. In the middle of the night, when most residents are asleep, demand falls. In the morning, thousands of showers and faucets may turn on almost simultaneously. Consumption changes again throughout the day. Then another peak may occur in the early evening. If the treatment plant and every pump had to respond instantly to every faucet being opened, the system would be difficult, expensive, and unstable. That's where storage comes in. When consumption is low, reservoirs can be filled. When demand rises, the stored water helps meet the peak. Beyond balancing production and consumption, this reserve can help during maintenance, temporary failures, and emergencies, while also contributing the flow rates needed for firefighting. Every water supply network must somehow solve three different problems. The first is having water available. That's storage. The second is getting the water to the property. That's distribution. The third is delivering it with enough force to rise through pipes, overcome losses, and flow properly from faucets. That involves pressure. These problems are related, but they aren't the same. And this is precisely where the central decision in our investigation appears. Who should store the water? The city or each individual building? In the indirect system commonly found in many Brazilian homes, part of that responsibility is transferred to the property. The water supplied by the utility doesn't necessarily feed every fixture directly. First, it enters the water tank. A float valve controls the filling process and shuts off the incoming water when the maximum level is reached. When someone uses water, the level falls. The float valve opens again and allows the tank to refill. As long as the supply remains adequate throughout the day, the tank stays full. If the water main loses pressure for a few hours, the property can continue using its reserve, provided the residents manage their consumption. But why place the tank at the highest point in the house? Because elevated water represents stored energy. Imagine a rock at the top of a ramp. As long as it remains there, it has the potential to roll downward. Water behaves in a similar way. A pump, pressure from the main, or a difference in elevation carries the water up to the tank. After that, gravity can handle the distribution. The tank works like a hydraulic battery. An electrical battery stores energy for later use. The tank stores water and, because it's elevated, also stores gravitational potential energy. When a faucet opens, that energy becomes movement and pressure. It's like a small private reservoir installed inside the home. The pressure it generates depends mainly on the difference in height between the water level and the fixture. The taller that vertical column, the greater the available pressure tends to be. About 33 feet of water column produces roughly 1 bar of pressure. This means a tank only 6 or 10 feet above the shower creates relatively modest pressure. That's why some homes have weak shower flow, especially when the tank sits at nearly the same level as the bathroom. Pipes that are too narrow, too many bends, and long runs also consume part of that energy. Water loses pressure as it encounters friction inside the piping. When gravity pressure isn't enough, booster pumps can be used. But the tank's greatest advantage remains. It can distribute water without continuously depending on an electric pump. If the power goes out, an ordinary household pump stops working. Gravity doesn't. That doesn't mean the residence becomes completely independent. If the interruption continues, the tank will eventually run dry. It provides temporary autonomy, not an unlimited water source. It also requires care. It must remain covered and protected from insects, dirt, and animals. It needs to rest on a structure capable of supporting its weight. A tank holding roughly 264 gallons contains about 1 metric ton of water, not including the tank itself or its supports. The installation must allow for inspection, cleaning, safe overflow, and maintenance. A neglected tank can turn a hydraulic advantage into a health hazard. Even so, when it's properly designed and maintained, the simplicity is remarkable. And that simplicity proved especially useful during the development of Brazilian cities. Brazil urbanized at enormous speed throughout the 20th century. Entire neighborhoods emerged before water mains, public reservoirs, transmission pipelines, and pumping stations could fully keep pace with population growth. Even when treated, water had already reached an area. Pressure didn't always remain constant throughout the day. A neighborhood close to a reservoir and at a lower elevation may receive water easily. Another built on higher ground or at the far end of the network may experience lower pressure. During periods of peak consumption, these differences become even more apparent. Leaks, illegal connections, aging pipes, construction work, unplanned expansion, and insufficient capacity can also affect service. In some places, water service has been, or still is, intermittent. The network receives water during certain periods, and properties must store it to make it through the gaps. In that context, the water tank isn't merely an accessory. It acts as a buffer between the instability of the city and the family's daily routine. When pressure from the street is good, the reservoir fills gradually. During a consumption peak, the house doesn't need to draw its entire flow from the network at that exact moment. And if there's a brief maintenance shutdown, the faucets don't immediately run dry. It's the same principle as keeping a small supply of food at home. The grocery store doesn't need to deliver a bag of rice at the exact moment the family starts cooking, because some of that food is already stored in the pantry. The tank does the same thing with water. This solution became part of Brazilian codes, local recommendations, design practices, and construction habits. Water utilities often advise residents to maintain enough stored water to make it through temporary interruptions, frequently using approximately 1 day of consumption as a reference. The appropriate capacity, however, depends on the number of residents, consumption patterns, occupancy type, and the regulations that apply to the project. It isn't enough to buy the largest tank available. An oversized tank with low turnover can increase the amount of time water remains stored. One that's too small may empty quickly during an interruption. Proper sizing must balance reliability, water turnover, weight, space, and consumption. The first major revelation, then, is that the Brazilian water tank makes the home partially independent from short-term fluctuations in the public network. But that creates a new mystery. If storing water is so useful, why didn't American cities make millions of homes equally independent? The answer appears when we realize we've been looking for the water tank in the wrong place. Most American homes connected to public systems also depend on reservoirs. They just don't usually belong to each house individually. They're distributed throughout the city. A water tower is essentially a gigantic water tank shared by an entire community. Pumps carry water into the elevated tank, often during periods when consumption and operating costs are lower. The reservoir's height then helps maintain pressure throughout the network. When thousands of residents open their faucets in the morning, some of the stored water flows down into the system. When demand falls, pumps restore the level. The tower smooths out the difference between the capacity of the pumps and the population's immediate consumption. its appearance can vary. Some have a large spherical or cylindrical tank supported by a narrow structure. Others resemble enormous concrete goblets. Some reservoirs are built directly on elevated terrain, where the topography itself replaces part of the tower. A city may also use ground-level reservoirs combined with pumping stations, balancing tanks, and automated equipment. Sensors monitor levels and pressure. Pumps switch on or off as demand changes. Valves control zones located at different elevations. Emergency generators can keep essential equipment operating during power failures, so there's no single American system. In flat cities, elevated water towers may be highly visible. In mountainous areas, reservoirs positioned on higher ground supply neighborhoods below. In major urban centers, complex networks may combine gravity, pumping stations, and multiple pressure zones. The intended result is the same. Water should continuously reach the home's service line with enough pressure to supply its fixtures directly. The house doesn't need to wait for a tank to fill. The pressurized network supplies faucets, toilets, showers, and appliances as soon as they're activated. That's possible because a larger share of the responsibility for storage and pressure control remains concentrated within the public infrastructure. The tank didn't disappear. It changed scale and address. Instead of every family keeping roughly 130 or 264 gallons above the ceiling, a large municipal reservoir can serve thousands of customers. Maintenance, monitoring, and operation are concentrated within the water supply system. This model has advantages. The house doesn't need to reserve space beneath the roof, build a support capable of carrying tons of weight, periodically clean an elevated tank, or accept the relatively low pressure produced by only a few feet of water column. The water can also remain in circulation within a professionally operated and monitored system, although municipal reservoirs also require inspections, sanitary protection, and proper turnover. But centralization creates a clear dependency. If the public network loses pressure, a directly supplied home can lose water almost immediately. A Brazilian residence with a full tank may make it through the same interruption without even noticing, at least for several hours. The American system relies more heavily on the continuity of shared infrastructure. The Brazilian model distributes part of that security among individual properties. Neither strategy is perfect. Centralization allows technical control on a large scale, but a single failure can affect many customers. Decentralization provides local autonomy, but it multiplies millions of tanks that must be properly installed, covered, and cleaned. It would also be wrong to assume that no American home stores water. In rural areas, millions of properties aren't connected to municipal water systems. They use private wells. In that case, a pump draws water from underground and usually sends it to a pressure tank. This tank contains water and compressed air, allowing the plumbing system to maintain pressure and preventing the pump from switching on every time someone opens a faucet for a few seconds. It isn't exactly the same as a large storage tank designed to provide an entire day of autonomy. Its primary purpose is usually to stabilize pressure and reduce pump cycling. But rural systems may include cisterns and larger reservoirs when the well has a low flow rate or the water supply is irregular. Remote properties, farms, and homes in mountainous regions may also use elevated tanks. In those situations, the solution begins to look very similar to the Brazilian model. Pump water when it's available and use the stored supply later. Homes exposed to hurricanes, wildfires, or frequent outages may adopt emergency water storage. Private developments may maintain their own reservoirs for consumption, irrigation, or fire protection. And there's one American exception that's impossible to ignore: tall buildings. Pressure from the street has limits. If it's too high, it can damage pipes and fixtures on the lower floors. If it's too low, It can't carry water to the upper stories. That's why skyscrapers and other tall buildings divide their water distribution into zones. A pump may carry water to an upper reservoir. From there, gravity supplies certain floors. Another design may use variable speed pumps, lower reservoirs, pressure tanks, and pressure-reducing valves. In New York City, many tall buildings use the famous wooden water tanks installed on their rooftops. Water from the main reaches the lower levels, is pumped up to the tank, and then flows down to the apartments. The skyline proves that the principle behind the water tank is neither uniquely Brazilian nor technologically outdated. When conditions demand it, one of the most vertical cities in the United States turns to the same leading force: gravity. In Brazil, there are also buildings and some homes that receive water directly from the main, provided that pressure, continuity, design, and local regulations allow it. Residential complexes may use lower reservoirs, pumps, and pressurized systems without relying solely on a visible tank above each unit. Brazilian apartment buildings commonly use divided storage. A cistern or lower reservoir receives water from the utility. Pumps carry that water to an upper reservoir. From there, gravity supplies the apartments. On lower floors, the water column can produce excessive pressure, requiring pressure-reducing valves or the division of the building into zones. Once again, storage, pressure, and distribution must be treated as separate problems. Modern technologies are making this boundary less visible. Electronically controlled pumps adjust their speed according to demand. Sensors detect low levels and leaks. Telemetry systems allow utilities to monitor reservoirs and pressure in real time. Automatic valves isolate sections during pipe ruptures. Generators and alternative power sources protect essential pumping stations. More reliable Brazilian networks make direct supply technically possible in certain buildings. At the same time, the security provided by on-site storage remains valuable, especially where interruptions still occur or where regulations and local conditions require autonomy. In the United States, extreme events are also fueling discussions about redundancy, storage, and resilience. A reliable network isn't one that can never fail. It's an infrastructure system that combines maintenance, reserve capacity, alternative routes, emergency power, and rapid response. That's why there's no universal winner. The Brazilian residential water tank takes up space, adds weight to the building, requires cleaning, and generally provides pressure limited by its available height. In return, it offers autonomy, reduces the immediate impact of fluctuations in the network, and continues distributing water without electricity as long as some remains stored. The direct supply, common in American homes, simplifies the internal plumbing and can provide more consistent pressure. In return, it makes the residents more dependent on the continuity of the municipal system. Now let's return to the two houses from the beginning. In the Brazilian home, the water was treated by the city, traveled through the network, entered the building, and was stored above the ceiling. Urban water pressure had to be sufficient to fill the tank. After that, gravity took over the internal distribution. In the American home, the water was also treated, pumped, stored, and elevated. But much of that work happened before it reached the property. It may have passed through a water tower. It may have come from a reservoir on a hill. Its pressure may be maintained by pumping stations and automatic controls. Both houses depend on reservoirs. Both rely on pumps somewhere along the way. Both can use gravity. The fundamental difference is where each function was placed. In Brazil, some of the storage usually happens within the home itself. Across much of the United States, that storage is normally already part of the municipal infrastructure. The Brazilian water tank isn't simply a sign of old technology. It's an architectural response to the way the water supply was organized and to the need to protect domestic life from temporary fluctuations. The absence of a tank on an American roof also doesn't mean water travels directly from nature to the faucet. Behind that seemingly automatic pressure is an enormous infrastructure system made up of reservoirs, pumps, tanks, pipes, sensors, and operators. The greatest difference between these two houses isn't found on the roof. It lies in where each society decided to store its water. If you enjoy discovering the engineering hidden within homes and cities, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Then, in the next video, we can investigate another ordinary architectural detail that appears simple but reveals an entire story about how we build and organize the world around us.